Sanatorium under the sign of the hourglass. The journey was long. The train, which ran only once a week on that forgotten branch line, carried no more than a few passengers. Never before had I seen such archaic coaches, withdrawn from other lines long before. They were spacious as living rooms, dark and with many recesses. Corridors crossed the empty compartments at various angles. Labyrinthine and cold, they exuded an air of strange and frightening neglect. I moved from coach to coach, looking for a comfortable corner. Draughts were everywhere, cold currents of air shooting through the interiors, piercing the whole train from end to end. Here and there a few people sat on the floor, surrounded by their bundles, not daring to occupy the empty seats. Besides, those high, convex, oilcloth-covered seats were cold as ice and sticky with age. At the deserted stations, no passengers boarded the train. Without a whistle, without a groan, the train would slowly start again, as if lost in meditation. For a time I had the company of a man in a ragged railwayman's uniform, silent, engrossed in his thoughts. He pressed a handkerchief to his swollen, aching face. Later even he disappeared, having slipped out unobserved at some stop. He left behind him the mark of his body in the straw that lay on the floor, and a shabby black suitcase he had forgotten. Wading in straw and rubbish, I walked shakily from coach to coach. The open doors of the compartments were swinging in the draughts. There was not a single passenger left on the train. At last I met a conductor in the black uniform of that line. He was wrapping a thick scarf around his neck and collecting his things, a lantern, an official logbook. "We are nearly there, sir," he said, looking at me with washed-out eyes. The train was coming slowly to a halt, without puffing, without rattling, as if, together with the last breath of steam, life was slowly escaping from it. We stopped. Everything was empty and still, with no station buildings in sight. The conductor showed me the direction of the sanatorium. Carrying my suitcase, I started walking along a narrow white road towards the dark trees of a park. With some curiosity, I looked at the landscape. The road along which I was walking led up to the brow of a gentle hill, from which a wide expanse of country could be seen. The day was uniformly grey, extinguished, without contrasts, and perhaps, under the influence of that heavy and colourless aura, the great basin of the valley, in which a vast wooded landscape was arranged like theatrical scenery, seemed very dark. The rows of trees, one behind the other, ever greyer and more distant, descended the gentle slopes to the left and right. The whole landscape, sombre and grave, seemed almost imperceptibly to float, to shift slightly, like a sky full of billowing, stealthily moving clouds. The fluid strips and bands of forest seemed to rustle and grow with rustling, like a tide that swells gradually towards the shore. The rising white road wound itself dramatically through the darkness of that woody terrain. I broke a twig from a roadside tree. The leaves were dark, almost black. It was a strangely charged blackness, deep and benevolent, like restful sleep. All the different shades of grey in the landscape derived from that one colour. It was the colour of a cloudy summer dusk in our part of the country, when the landscape has become saturated with water after a long period of rain, and exudes a feeling of self-denial, a resigned and ultimate numbness that does not need the consolation of colour. It was completely dark among the trees of the parkland. I groped my way blindly on a carpet of soft needles. When the trees thinned, the planks of a footbridge resounded under my feet. Beyond it, against the blackness of the trees, loomed the grey walls of the many-windowed hotel that advertised itself as the sanatorium. The double-glass door of the entrance stood open. The little footbridge, with shaky handrails made of birch branches, led straight to it. In the hallway there was semi-darkness and a solemn silence. I moved on tiptoe from door to door, trying to see the numbers on them. Rounding a corner, I had last met a chambermaid. She had run out of a room as if having torn herself from someone's importuning arms, and was breathless and excited. She could hardly understand what I was saying. I had to repeat it. She was fidgeting helplessly. Had my telegram reached them? She spread her arms. Her eyes moved sideways. She was only awaiting an opportunity to leap back behind the half-opened door at which she kept squinting. "I have come a long way. I booked a room here by telegram," I said with some impatience. "Whom shall I see about it?" She did not know. "Perhaps you could wait in the restaurant," she babbled. "Everyone is asleep just now. When the doctor gets up, I shall announce you." They are asleep. But it is daytime, not night. "Here everybody is asleep all the time. Didn't you know?" she said, looking at me with interest now. "Besides, it's never night here," she added coyly. She had obviously given up the idea of escape, for she was now picking fussily at the lace of her apron. I left her there, and entered the half-lit restaurant. There were some tables, and a large buffet ran the length of one wall. I was now feeling a little hungry, and was pleased to see some pastries and a cake on the buffet. I placed my suitcase on one of the tables. They were all unoccupied. I clapped my hands. No response. I looked into the next room, which was larger and brighter. That room had a wide window or loggia overlooking the landscape I already knew, which, framed by the window, seemed like a constant reminder of morning, suggestive of deep sorrow and resignation. On some of the tables stood the remains of recent meals, uncorked bottles, half-empty glasses. Here and there lay the tips not yet picked up by the waiters. I returned to the buffet and looked at the pastries and cake. They looked most appetizing. I wondered whether I should help myself. I suddenly felt extremely greedy. There was a particular kind of apple flan that made my mouth water. I was about to lift a piece of it with a silver knife when I felt somebody behind me. The chambermaid had entered the room in her soft slippers and was touching my back lightly. "The doctor will see you now," she said, looking at her fingernails. She stood facing me, and, conscious of the magnetism of her wriggling hips, did not turn away. She provoked me, increasing and decreasing the distance between our bodies, as, having left the restaurant, we passed many numbered doors. The passage became ever darker. In almost complete darkness, she brushed against me fleetingly. "Here is the doctor's door," she whispered. "Please go in." Dr. Gotthard was standing in the middle of the room to receive me. He was a short, broad-shouldered man with a dark beard. "We received your telegram yesterday," he said. "We sent our carriage to the station, but you must have arrived by another train. Unfortunately, the railway connections are not very good. Are you well? Is my father alive? I asked, staring anxiously into his calm face. Yes, of course, he answered, calmly meeting my questioning eyes. That is, within the limits imposed by the situation, he added, half closing his eyes. You know as well as I that from the point of view of your home, from the perspective of your own country, your father is dead. This cannot be entirely remedied. That death throws a certain shadow on his existence here. But does father himself know it? Does he guess? I asked him in a whisper. He shook his head with deep conviction. Don't worry, he said in a low voice. None of our patients know it, or can guess. The whole secret of the operation, he added, ready to demonstrate its mechanism on his fingers, is that we have put back the clock. Here we are always late by a certain interval of time of which we cannot define the length. The whole thing is a matter of simple relativity. Here, your father's death, the death that has already struck him in your country, has not occurred yet. In that case, I said, my father must be on his deathbed, or about to die. You don't understand me, he said in a tone of tolerant impatience. Here we reactivate time past with all its possibilities, therefore also including the possibility of a recovery. He looked at me with a smile, stroking his beard. But now you probably want to see your father. According to your request, we have reserved for you the other bed in your father's room. I shall take you there. When we were out in the dark passage, Dr. Gothard spoke in a whisper. I noticed that he was wearing felt slippers, like the chambermaid. We allow our patients to sleep long hours and to spare their vitality. Besides, there is nothing better to do. At last we stopped in front of one of the doors, and he put a finger to his lips. Enter quietly. Your father is asleep. Settle down to sleep too. This is the best thing for you to do. Goodbye for now. Goodbye, I whispered, my heart beating fast. I pressed the handle and the door opened like unresisting lips that part in sleep. I went in. The room was almost empty, grey and bare. Under a small window my father was lying on an ordinary wooden bed covered by a pile of bedding, fast asleep. His breathing extracted layers of snoring from the depths of his breast. The whole room seemed to be lined with snores from floor to ceiling, and yet new layers were being added all the time. With deep emotion I looked at father's thin, emaciated face, now completely engrossed in the activity of snoring. A remote, trance-like face, which, having left its earthly aspect, was confessing its existence somewhere on a distant shore, by solemnly telling its minutes. There was no second bed in the room. Piercingly cold air blew in through the windows. The stove had not been lit. And they don't seem to care much for patients here, I thought, to expose such a sick man to such draughts. And no one seems to do any cleaning here either. A thick layer of dust covered the floor and the bedside table, on which stood medicine bottles and a cup of cold coffee. Stacks of pastries in the restaurant, yet they give the patients black coffee instead of anything more nourishing. But perhaps this is a detail compared with the benefits of having the clock put back. I slowly undressed and climbed onto Father's bed. He did not wake up, but his snoring, having probably been pitched too high, fell an octave lower, forsaking its high declamatory tone. It became, as it were, more private, for his own use. I tucked Father in under his eiderdown to protect him as much as possible from the draughts in the room. Soon I fell asleep by his side.
Was